Hello, friends. Hello, Methodist Temple. I hope this finds you doing well. I pray and I hope that you're staying warm and safe. Of course, we had to cancel worship this morning due to the weather, but I thought I would record a little sermonette to share a few thoughts about Epiphany Sunday. That's what today would have been. It's Epiphany Sunday, and what that means for us as Christians is that really Christmas is not over yet. In fact, Christmas starts on December the 24th and extends all the way to January 6th. For most of our culture, of course, Christmas is all but over. Our trees are put away, our ornaments are packed up. But for us as Christians, we're called to continue to reflect on this idea of incarnation and the gift of Christmas. And for me, what that basically means when we talk about incarnation and the gift of Christmas is that God has made God's home with us. God has made God's home with us. That is the gift of Christmas and the gift of incarnation. And today, we as a people of faith are called to reflect on what does it mean to make our home in God's presence. And traditionally, as we think about that, the story we think about on this particular Sunday is the story of the wise men. And certainly they have a lot to teach us about our own spiritual journeys. And I'm not going to read that story to you this morning, but I would encourage you to check it out. It's in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And let me just share with you a few thoughts about the story of the Magi, or the wise men. The first thing I'll throw out there about the wise men is that, well, they come to Christ, they find their way to Jesus, not through sacred text, not through an evangelist, but they follow a star. What we have here is an example in Christian theology, an example of natural theology. What we mean by that is that God's presence is revealed through the created order. God's presence is revealed through the created world around us. And so essentially what we're suggesting is by listening to the world and listening to our lives, we can discover things about God. And that theme is woven throughout the entirety of Scripture. We see it in the Psalms. It says in the Psalms that the heavens declare the glory of God and the earth is the handiwork of God's presence. I think about the prophet Isaiah, who during his call story in Isaiah chapter 6, he has a vision of the world, and he says, basically the angel in Isaiah's vision says that the whole earth is filled with God's glory. Even the Apostle Paul points in the direction of what we call natural theology when he says in Romans chapter 1 that the creation itself basically points to things we can know about the Creator. A modern example of natural theology comes from Frederick Buechner, who was a Presbyterian theologian. His quote that I would love to share is Buechner summarizes all of his theology and all of his teaching in one basic quote. He says, if you want to hear God speak, then listen to your life. Listen to what happens to you, because it is through what happens to you that God speaks. And of course, the story of the wise men, what we find is something very similar. They follow the star. They follow the natural order, and it leads them to the feet of Christ. And in some ways, we do some of this during this time of year. In the midst of a new year, we reflect on our lives. We think about what's leading us to life, what's taking life away. And in many ways, it's a form of discernment. And so that's the first thing I'll throw out there about the wise men, is that they find their way to Christ by listening to their lives, listening to the world around them. The second thing I'll throw out about the wise men is that they initially did not just come to Christ. They went by the way of King Herod. And Herod, he was known as Herod the Great, was appointed by the Romans as king of the Jews about 40 years before Christ would have been born. And he was a ruthless leader. His big thing was he liked to build huge buildings, and he was remarkably just awful to his people. He was awful to his family. He was awful to the people that built the buildings. And he was certainly not the type of leader that would share his power with others. And so when the wise men go to Herod's palace and they ask about where this new king of the Jews is, we can only imagine what that would have been like. And if you look in the text, it says that the people in Jerusalem and all the religious people were very concerned about the situation because of the fact that the wise men came and they asked about the new king of the Jews. Essentially what we're having happen here is they're calling into question the way of Herod, the way of intimidation, the way of violence, the way of greed. They're calling all of that into question, which of course leads us to the final scene in the story of the wise men. They start at Herod's palace, but they end up, of course, laying their gifts at the feet of Christ. And the gifts are very symbolic. They of course give the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The gift of gold points to the reality that the Christ child is the true king of the universe. Frankincense points to the priestly function of Christ. Jesus, in the sense of being a priest, points us to God. And then myrrh was something used in embalming and in ancient embalming practices, and that points to Jesus's death. And really, if you put all this together, what you discover is that Jesus is the polar opposite in terms of the way he is a leader and king. While Herod is violent and he's an intimidator and he's awful to the people, Christ, on the other hand, who is the true king of the universe, lays his life down for the good of others. A modern example of Christian leadership, I think, can be found in the life of President Jimmy Carter. And of course, some of the big news of this past week is President Carter died at 100 years old. And while I'm not old enough to remember when he was president, the thing I remember or know about Jimmy Carter is that his life post-presidency was remarkable. After he lost his election to President Reagan in a landslide, what did Carter do? Well, he went home and he taught Sunday school at his Baptist church. He dedicated himself to building homes for the homeless through Habitat of Humanity, and then he worked for peace within the world. I heard a quote this week as I was reading about Carter. I think it comes from maybe the president of Emory University, and when he introduced former President Carter, he said he's one of the only presidents that used his presidency as a step up in the way that he was a leader after his presidency. Another story that I came across about President Carter came from an article written by Josh Claiborne, who's a member of our congregation. And in the article, though, he tells a story of Carter in the 1950s. I guess he was in the Navy, and he was being interviewed for a position within the Navy. And the Admiral, of course, was grilling him with all sorts of questions. At one point, the Admiral asked Jimmy Carter, where did you graduate in your class? And Carter rather pridefully said, I was like number 57 out of 800. And then next, the Admiral asked the question, did you do your best? At which point Carter paused and he said, no, I haven't always done my best. That basic question, did you do your best, was a guiding principle of Carter's life. Well, to apply that to the Magi, they asked this question in a little bit different way. Rather than did you do your best, the question the Magi are asking is, are we striving for the best? Are we striving for a life that's devoted to Christ? Or are we striving for a life that is devoted after the character of King Herod? And certainly, if we're honest with ourselves, if we listen to our lives today, we could admit that we all have places in which we can grow. And what I would like to encourage you to do as you have some time to kind of sit home and reflect on my hunches, a lot of us are going to be sitting home for a few days. I would like to encourage you to think about, if you could put it into a word, what would your spiritual goal be this year? As you strive for the best, as you strive to grow, what would be a goal that summarizes how you want to grow this year? I take this idea from a professor by the name of Brian Russell, who has a pretty good podcast called the Deep Dive Spirituality Podcast. And his word for spiritual growth last year was done, D-O-N-E. And he used it as an acronym. And I find it to be helpful to think about ways that I could grow in my own life. So let me just share it with you real quick. For D, Dr. Russell said it stood for dumb habits and draining activities. And so he was done with that. For O, it stood for obligations that did not align with his deepest values. He was done with that. For N, he talked about he was done with nurturing others without nurturing himself. And then for E, he was done with seeking external validation or of external validation from people on the outside of himself rather than listening to his own inner voice. And so he used the word done to summarize his goal for spiritual growth. And so here's the thing I'm going to encourage you to think about. What would your word be this year that defines your spiritual goals for the upcoming year? Not only that, is it striving after the best? Is it striving after the Christ-like goals as the wise men and the Magi teach us to strive after? I love at the very end of the story with the wise men, it says after they come to Christ, it says they go home by a different road. They don't go home by the road of Herod. They go home by the road of Christ. And certainly I would encourage us all to do that both today and always. God bless you. Stay warm. Be safe.